All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our University Business Web Seminar here today, which is entitled Building Resiliency in Higher Ed Cybersecurity Programs, which is brought to you by the generous support by our sponsor here today, Mandiant. Now, before we get started, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping items. If at any time you need any technical support, please use the chat panel, which you can find it's on the right side of your screen. Then just select on my name, and that is Stephen Blackburn or host, and then just type in your message, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. I'm also about to submit a phone number and access code in the chat that you have here, and you can dial into that number if you want to listen in privately or if you don't have any speakers. So just look out for that at some point. We will also be welcoming any questions that you have here today, and that will take place during a Q&A session that will be at the end of the presentation. You can submit your question at any time throughout the presentation by using the Q&A panel, and that is located on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and then just select your questions to all panelists. Also, last point, and then we'll get started. I would just like to make you all know that if you would like to access the web seminar at a later time, you'll be pleased to know that everyone who's registered and all of you who are attending here today, you will receive an email with a link to the slides as well as an archive recording. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers that we have here today. We have Monty Ratzluff, who is the director of the University of California's Cyber Risk Program. Chris Schreiber, who is the owner of and a higher ed cybersecurity strategist at campus CISO. And we have John Ford, who is the VP of Government Consulting Solutions at Mandiant. Great to have you with us. All right, now, before we begin, just want to say, I'll just let you know that the format of what this webinar will be is it will be more of a campfire discussion where I'll be asking a question about cybersecurity to our speakers that I just mentioned and have them answer. There will also be some poll questions throughout that, and I just invite you to take part in those polls when they come in. But now, before I ask the first question, I'll just let our speakers introduce themselves. Monty, I want to start with you.
Hi, Monty Ratzliff. I'm with the University of California Office of the President in the Cyber Risk Program. I want to thank everybody for attending today and looking forward to our discussion.
Awesome. Chris?
I'm Chris Schreiber, and I have about 25 years in higher education experience and currently work as a freelance consultant with college and university CIOs and CISOs.
Awesome. And John?
How you doing? I'm John Ford. I'm with Mandiant, and I lead all of our state and local education business here at Mandiant. And so we're very excited to discuss this, important topic with you today. My background is that I'm retired cybersecurity executive out of the FBI before coming over here to Mandiant. So as Chris and Monty, I think combined with us, we have exactly at least a few decades with us for sure. So we really look forward to bringing that experience to you.
Awesome. Perfect. Now let's get started. We do have quite a bit to unwrap here. So, okay, so I think, yeah, a good place to start is to talk about, today's climate with challenges and priorities. Can one of you, tell me a few of, some of the top challenges and priorities that, you see facing higher ed cybersecurity teams right now?
I think from our perspective, one of the key challenges I think probably most higher ed faces is funding for cybersecurity. That's always been a challenge and probably will be a challenge for years to come. And then I think another challenge that I believe everybody's facing, regardless of higher ed, is talent. And I think we'll probably talk about that during today's discussion. But that's certainly an area that is a challenge. I think we are faced with a lot of demands around third-party risk management. So addressing that has been forefront for us. And that includes just general risk management, I would say, as well. So understanding risks, having leadership understand risks, and making those things work. And then I would say finally, research security. This, for higher areas that do research, securing that data and facilitating researchers in their work is a challenge.
Perfect. Anyone else would like to answer that? Okay. Oh,
Just to kind of build on what Monty said, one of the common themes that I hear when I'm talking with some of my customers is they're not getting new dollars to solve these increasing cybersecurity threats. And so CIOs are really having to juggle moving funding from one area of their IT organization to other areas oftentimes. Instead of getting net new dollars to solve the cybersecurity risk, they have to look at their overall priorities and how to reallocate it. So that seems to be a common theme that I'm hearing is how do we do more to reduce risk while also keeping our operations sustained?
okay, perfect. Now we're on to threat actors. What are some that, are targeting various colleges and universities? And I'm speaking in regards to TTPs specifically.
Yeah, sure. Let me jump off on that topic. I know that both Chris and Monty will have some comments and thoughts on this one as well. Um, one of the things that we've seen is really the evolution of how the actors are trying to, gain persistence and access to different network systems, especially in the education, higher education market. For years and years, we started considering that denial of service was, going to be an issue. Then we started seeing a multi-layered attack with denial of service and then doing exploits at the same time. While those became under control, then we really started seeing towards phishing became one of the most prevalent, successful attacks. Um, but to be candid, we have seen that there's been a lot of great technology implementation, certainly a lot of training. I mean, who doesn't take their annual cybersecurity training and have an entire segment devoted to phishing and being aware of that? We do as well here at Mandiant. But what we saw in the last about 18 months is that's flowed into where, as far as successful breaches, and this is based on about 250,000 hours of doing incident response that Mandiant did last year, that phishing has moved to about 11% of the successful attacks, where the majority of attacks that are successful now have been based upon external vulnerabilities, as well as misuse or leveraging compromised credentials. So, they've really taken this new way to see how far they can get within a network without using any exploits, and trying to live within an environment undetected for longer periods of time, to do reconnaissance or other actions. So this has become even harder, right, for the defenders to defend against, because if there's really not a good way of tripping some type of indicator of compromise, or some type of overt technique, the defenders are having an increasingly challenging job today to find these actors and how they're trying to leverage accesses to these systems, either for a direct overt action or because they're going to use that system to pivot to another system, maybe even in another university or another location. So the defenders definitely have their jobs cut out for them today, more so, even more so than they did last year. Chris or Monty, your thoughts?
Oh,
I
oh, there you go.
I think understanding, the threat actors that are targeting your organization helps you to identify, uh, when you know their TTPs and you know the threat actors and you know their motives. It helps you to then prioritize, where you're placing your controls, where you're placing your efforts. So it's certainly an important aspect of threat intelligence.
And Chris?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting trends is the use of compromised credentials has always been one of the big risks in higher education. When you look at institutions, we have hundreds of thousands of credentials at a lot of individual institutions, and aggregate that out across the whole vertical, and there's millions of credentials in play. And so it's really hard for the defenders to look at, is this a legitimate log on? Maybe a faculty member is traveling, or is it a threat actor that's actually got hold of those credentials and coming in? And that's been a common theme that I've heard at a lot of institutions I've talked to lately as well, to build off of what John just mentioned.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we're actually at our first poll question. I'm opening that right now. You should see that in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So as you can see, we're asking which cyber threats pose the biggest challenge, for your higher ed organization. And this one you can choose more than one answer. We have research and data compliance, email-based attacks. That includes ransomware and phishing, among others. Another option is supply chain security, like vendor partner security, lack of cyber awareness among students, faculty, and staff, as well as insider threats. So again, we have about 20 seconds or so. So please take your time to check off all the answers that apply to your college or university. And I will share those results shortly once it closes. Okay, perfect. I just shared the results, and I'll just quickly go into our next question, unless you can also comment on what you saw following this. But first, so to get ahead of some of these threat actors that we just went over a few minutes ago, a top priority in higher ed is obviously it's securing data across their organizations. And, as you can see, a few of them here that are listed, like student, faculty, and staff data, healthcare data, research data. So with all that in mind, what are some strategies you can share? And more importantly, what are some strategies that can make them more proactive?
Well, I think I'll start with just understanding, your organization's landscape and the inventory of where your critical data resides. I think just knowing where your data is pretty important to even start. And it's not an easy thing to do, for sure. But that's certainly something that helps guide where you should be focusing. I think another thing that's helpful is identifying metrics, cyber metrics that are reasonable for you to obtain and also impactful. And that's not an easy thing to do, is having the right metrics to look at, where some of the risks might be, or where some of the gaps might be. And then once you have an idea of what the risks are, is working with your leadership and helping them understand risks. Going to leadership and saying that you need, some fancy new tool doesn't really tell the picture of what you're trying to solve and why they should care. And I think just having regular conversations with your leadership about cyber risk keeps it top of mind for them. And it also helps them to realize that, the security of the organization is not a destination. It's a process. And if you're having those regular conversations, they understand that there's not really a done. It's just, you got to keep pivoting, because the threat actors are going to pivot as well. And I think lastly, I would just say an overall strategy is just avoid the quest for perfection. Get something that's good, and go with that and build on that. Because waiting for perfect is never going to happen, and we would be all sort of paralyzed by not moving forward because we expect something to be perfect. So work on what's good enough. That's those are the things that I think would help organizations really focus and have, get the ball rolling and keep it rolling.
Great. So, I would add, really layer on top of what Monty has talked about, as well as Chris, I would consider there's probably like three key areas to focus on from a proactive capability when you're trying to protect those key data, right? So, first thing, Lonnie's absolutely correct, right? You have to understand what your key assets are, your what we call sometimes crown jewels or high value assets, where they are, what it contains, and what are the compensating and kind of layered controls that are on there as well. Um, and which really plays into parts 2 and 3. So since we know as cybersecurity, our job is our primary job is to defend the networks, to protect the networks from compromise. So for protecting or defending those networks, that's against really those who are trying to compromise it. So who are those people and how are they trying to do that? And two key areas that we see based upon that is really understanding your attack surface. And in the educational environment, that's a really hard thing to do sometimes because you could think about just not only universities and their locations and those who may be, working from other environments that are across the world, within the United States, within your own state, you have a very large attack surface to consider. But to get at least an attack surface measurement across your key assets is going to be very important. And at the velocity of today's uh, actors that we see, whether they're state-sponsored actors or criminal actors, or even insider threats today, we really want to be able to understand what that looks like on a very often recurring basis. In the old days, we would do a red team or pen test. It was done every couple of years. We're needing to look at that now, almost on a daily or weekly basis. What does it look like? What does the external boundaries of our organizations look like today? Is there any drift in what it looks like? Is there any criticals that we need to fix? And do we need to understand is something that's been exposed that we just were not aware of? And also the other side of it is internal to your network. We all have, many universities have multifaceted organizations of how they do their network topology, different locations, or even within colleges, within universities may have different technology stacks. And really understanding how all these products are working together that you're using to defend your networks. Since all the products that we purchase, and Mandy, it's vendor independent, so we don't honestly care what you have in there, but we just want it to work to the best available ability it has. But being able to use attack capabilities and really validate that these controls are acting as they should is of really key importance. What we see in a lot of the times when we try to validate network topologies, network architecture, network security, is that only about 9% of critical alerts of attackers actually make it to the defender SIM. And there's about a 91% miss rate on these attacks. That's pretty high. And it's not that the technologies are not doing what they should, but in working in concert, they're not doing what they should. So validating that on a recurring basis, using the actual attacks of the adversaries, of these criminal organizations, of these ransomware actors, of these state actors across your network is key. To understand what tomorrow's breach looks like today will help you defend better for what tomorrow's breach could be and mitigate those threats and drown out that risk.
Perfect. Thanks. Chris, you want anything to add to that?
No, I think probably the one thing to reemphasize that Monty brought up is definitely take a data-centric approach as you think about where are the assets that you have to protect. And I think that's especially critical as universities adopt more external SaaS solutions. Pretty much every school is trying to figure out how do I protect data when faculty may be using their own personally owned devices. And if you set up your policies and your strategies based on the type of data that you're trying to protect, you can actually structure your program to focus on that data risk, regardless of where that lives. If it's on your own data center, if it's in a third-party cloud data center, or if it's on a faculty or staff personally owned device, you can structure your program around that if you really keep that data-centric mentality.
Perfect. Awesome. Next question here. So this is an interesting statistic. So John, a 2022 report from Mandiant, it found that 25.8% of investigated initial access came through the exploitation of public-facing applications. And, as you know, this underscores how important it is to maintain an up-to-date inventory of your assets and vulnerabilities. This same report, also found that college and universities, need to identify, enumerate, and harden internet-facing devices, hosts, applications, and network services. Do you want to just discuss, this to a little bit further for us?
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. This really has got into where we started off that, and I'm hoping that I can tie some of these areas together that Chris and Monty have brought forward. This does get back to risk and honestly what you can accept and what you can't at the end of the day. But, we all want to mitigate risk to the point that we can. But we have to be, risk can't be something that is static, that becomes something that we solidify or statue. It must be something that is adaptable, because the topology of the adversary certainly is changing on a daily basis. We're seeing them become much more adept at being able to do compromises in ways that just previously had not been considered. And one of the areas that we saw was that real shift, as we talked about, that phishing through email is no longer the number one successful vector into breaching. You start looking at the external applications from a vulnerability perspective, and using legitimate credentials by the adversaries becomes their preferred method now for moving successfully into an organization. And so, those two areas, we kind of look at attack surface, really to mitigate these in two different ways. From this report, certainly we talk about what do those external facing assets look like. And, Monty brought up, and so did Chris, we have to understand what's the most important things that we as a university feel we should protect, and we should know where they are. And this is something that is just critical to have identified and documented um, on a very regular basis. And it needs to be also not only reviewed on a consistent basis, but updated on a consistent basis. I mean, we're talking something more than once a year at this point now, because, as organizations grow, universities and new programs run on, we want to make sure that those are continually cataloged throughout the calendar years. And once we know what those risks and assets are, and we know where the devices that should be defending them are, then it helps us understand what we should be looking at on that external side. Understanding that attack surface, and I'm really talking more than a NESA scan. I'm really understanding what the attack surface looks like. Look at from an adversary's point of view, and that is exactly what we're trying to bring forth. Is that we want to look at the external boundaries of the university from an adversary's viewpoint, and how they're going to look at it from a perspective of, can they compromise and how can they compromise? Because there's whole groups of organizations today that's their only job. Their only job is to breach a network, set up persistence, and sell that persistence to someone else. And that's just the new market that we're looking at, quite frankly, especially in multifaceted extortion and ransomware. So having an attack surface run, quite frankly, on a very frequent basis is key to understand, has there been any changes, whether these changes were because of updates or changes because something that's occurred where, bad actors have actually stood up some of these devices that we're just unaware of. Monty brought up earlier, he brought up supply chain earlier as another topic that we'll get into. But we have to consider that as part of something that we have to have enumeration of, and we have to understand, is there risk to these third-party connections? And what does that bring in? Because that is trusted access. So, really understanding what your external boundaries look like, as well as your internal boundaries. How are you segmented? How are the networks segmented? What are the protection mechanisms that are defined within each? And are those controls on a continual basis being validated that they're doing exactly what they should, so the defenders get the right information at the right time so they can action it in the right way? Becomes all part of a risk plan. You really have to have those drivers about key controls, key data, and being able to validate that the security is where it should be for those key assets, to really be more successful here in the future as these actors are evolving.
Perfect. Thank you. And I'm just going to move right along since we do have quite a few questions left. But First off, we do have a second poll, which I am launching right now. You have 30 seconds to answer, so please do so when you can in the lower right-hand corner. So what stage is your institution in using, third-party solutions for processing and or storing sensitive data? And that can be, cloud-based ERPs, student or SISs, research computing, etc. Have a few seconds left. Okay, perfect. I'm just going to share those results now. All right, and now I will move to the next question, but you can also look at those answers simultaneously. Okay, and now here we are to our fifth question here. Now, do any of you have any recommendations, on where to prioritize immediate efforts, with insight into the assets that are high risk and that are being targeted by threat actors?
I can take this as well. That's fine. Monty, would you like to start, sir? Okay, not a problem. One of the things that we recommend always, and I believe everyone on this panel will recommend the exact same thing, is, and we've hit on it a couple times now, but it's worth reemphasizing. Having a crown jewels assessment or inventory done is key. Um, because by doing that, you will gain great insight into where this data is and how it's being protected. And I'm not talking protection just from a product perspective, but I'm also talking from a defender perspective and how it's being categorized, and the analysis of the protection capabilities are done. So risk against there is very key. And so if we were going to do that, we would do this kind of crown jewels assessment across the board. Each location within a university or each college within a university is going to see this a little bit differently. And so we want to ensure that there's a consistent and coordinated type of inventory that's really done. So at the macro level of the university, they understand what's being protected, where their assets, and where the prioritization of those funds and controls should be.
Perfect. And I see Monty, you might have had something to add to that, or?
Oh, I was shaking in agreement. Yes.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add is also don't lose sight of the fundamentals. I think a lot of times it's easy to focus on new technology solutions that are supposed to help defend your environment, but don't lose sight of things like keeping your systems patched, having good backups in place. A lot of times those are just as critical as you're looking at protecting these assets, even though they're not what might be top of mind for a cybersecurity investment or a prioritization.
Yeah, Chris, I'm gonna layer one thing on top of that because it's close to my heart. We highly recommend that compromise assessments of networks are done on a routine basis, maybe even annually. Layering technology on a pristine environment is one thing. Layering technology and capabilities on an already compromised but unknown that it's compromised system doesn't really provide you success. So doing that compromise assessment throughout an environment will let you know if there's anything in there. There's some back doors that maybe have been undiscovered. Some previous red teams might have done some kind of penetration test and left their tools in there that are still whitelisted. Or quite frankly, almost every time we do an incident response, we find at least one other bad actor that's gone undetected within that breach. So it's always good as a good hygiene to ensure that on a regular basis, a compromise assessment's done if you're protecting a more secure environment.
Right, thank you. So this one is a two-parter. I'll just start by asking the first question, then we can tackle the second one later. Are there any best practices that any of you can, recommend for performing asset discovery and vulnerability detection?
Well, I would say best practices in performing, sort of your mileage may vary depending on the tool sets that you have and the environment, but I think the importance of it, and I think I'll answer the second question is, especially in a higher ed environment, there are assets that are on the internet that you may not even know are there. And so if you're doing scans for, discovery, whether or not you're doing vulnerabilities on top of that, but at least discovery is important so that you know what is out there that is exposed and available. We have a lot in the higher ed sphere. There's just things like student websites, there's professor websites, there's researcher websites, and sometimes thousands of applications and web presences that you may not even know exist. So I think just understanding that is pretty key, and having that visibility understands what your threat landscape sort of looks like and your attack surface looks like.
All right, perfect. Anyone else want to answer any of these two questions?
Let me take the second question. What are the benefits of increased visibility? You know, um, I don't mean this to sound like a tagline, but it is something that I kind of grew up with from when I was raised. But there used to be an old commercial about this mechanic, and he said, "You can pay me now, or you can pay me later." And there's a lot of truth to that. Running an attack surface scan on a daily basis and understanding what changes, what's newly exposed, um, may take a little bit of a person's time to mitigate, but it provides great understanding to provide consistent and coordinated practices across the university. What really hurts is if there's a breach because of that. And these breaches can be very expensive, very costly, and can cost the brand of an organization. And many universities, rely on many dollars that come externally, whether that's, it's through tuition or through grants or through donors, and the brand and protecting that data and that research, and the university itself are very important. And if you really kind of compare the costs of what that could look like, it's really important to know what the vulnerability could cause tomorrow. As we like to say, understanding tomorrow's breach today can provide a lot of valuable information to protect yourself.
Perfect. Anything you want to add to that, Chris? Best practice recommendations or benefits of increased visibility?
I think one of the key things is you can't defend what you don't know about. And I know Monty has experienced this, and I have as well as a university CISO, where you suddenly discover that there's some research lab you didn't even know about that built a whole pool of data sitting up in AWS, for example. And so it has your institution's data, but it's not on your network, and you wouldn't even know about it if you didn't have some methodology in place of being able to discover where that data is being placed, who's managing it, and then being able to extend your protections around it.
Perfect. Thank you. So Monty, this one is obviously directed to you. So first, like, how is the University of California, addressing vendor risk and approaching overarching security policy governance?
Well, with vendor risk, we do risk assessments of those suppliers that are either going to provide a service for us when it comes to data, or we're going to leverage a system or an application. And so we try to understand based on the level of data, the risk assessment may be sort of a lighter touch, or it may be a more robust risk assessment. So we really try to focus on what is the data that we're talking about, what type of data. We also have contractual requirements for our suppliers. So, we have expectations and specifically around that, again, that type of data is how are they going to handle that data, how they can protect that data, how are they going to let us know if they have an incident or something's going on in a timely fashion. So there's a lot of things in the legalese that help us enforce that when needed. And then I think another thing that we try to focus on is just limiting the data or limiting the access to only what is required. I think too often we go into agreements with suppliers or applications or however, whatever it translates to be, but we give them a trove of data that maybe they only need 4 or 5 elements, but we're giving them 30. And so it's good to look at that, and so that you sort of can reduce your exposure to say, okay, if you don't need the social security number, we're not going to give it to you. If you don't need, an address, you're not getting that. And sometimes you don't even need the first name or last name of an individual. So you just kind of have to understand what the business process is, what are the goals, what are the requirements, and then tailor the data to meet those requirements and sort of keep it to that least privilege principle there. And in terms of policy, it's really a team effort at UC. And when I say policy, I mean the big P policy. We work with our CISOs, we work with our faculty, we work with our CIOs on policy and try to tailor it to as best we can with their input. And then there's a formal process of having that approved through the presidential channels. But and I say what I said about vendor risk and policies, not to say that we've nailed it. We still have a lot of work to do, but those are the things that we're looking at.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so we've come to our third and final poll for today. I just opened it now, lower right-hand corner. So how do you feel about the following statement? I am confident in my organization's readiness to secure the supply chain third-party vendors. Do you strongly agree, somewhat agree, disagree, or I don't know? Thank you very much. We have a few more seconds left. See if some people are still in the middle of progressing through it. Okay, I'll share those results now. Thank you very much. Okay, so here's the next question, and obviously, zero trust security, that it's a hot topic right now. In many organizations, they're considering or moving towards this particular model. With that in mind, how will zero trust adoption impact higher ed institutions? Chris, I don't know if you want to start with that one.
Sure. So this is definitely one of the hot buzzwords right now. I
Yeah.
think if you've been to any cybersecurity conference recently, there's pretty much every vendor is saying that they support zero trust. And I think the important thing to understand is what it really is. I think zero trust sometimes might be a bad label for what this means, because this is really about shifting your security posture to protect the identities and verifying the identities of the individuals as they use your resources. So this is really about attacking that vulnerability where the bad guys get hold of valid credentials and then use those credentials to do things. So when you look at zero trust, it's really shifting the perimeter. Instead of thinking about a firewall as your first line of defense, this is shifting to your identity ecosystem as being your first line of defense. And I think it's really important for institutions, especially as they start adopting more cloud-based services, being able to allow people to use services like Microsoft 365, for example, where you can log in and access your data from a personally owned device. Even though the data may be institutionally owned, you can access that data from your mobile phone, from your personal laptop, or from your office. And so zero trust is really about extending that protection based on who you say you are and validating that you actually have access to use those resources. I think this is a great opportunity for institutions to rethink some of how they allocate their security spend. So right now, like especially over the last 20 years, things like firewalls and IDS were one of the main investments for security. And as you start looking at how zero trust and adoption of some of these third-party and cloud-based services are going to impact your risk profile, a lot of institutions are taking a step back and looking at how do we rethink our approach to protecting our assets. And I think zero trust is going to become more and more important as organizations look at how do we do this hybrid model where some of our data is on campus, some is in the cloud, and our users could really be coming from anywhere.
Perfect. John, is there anything else you'd like to add to what Chris just mentioned?
You know, uh, the themes that we're talking about, right? And as it certainly is more assets we have or less kept within an on-prem environment anymore. The zero trust model is going to become increasingly important, right? I mean, post-COVID, even during COVID, obviously we were, kind of stretched out to the outer boundaries of where we were working, and what that looked like was certainly different for everyone. And during that time period, we saw a sharp increase in insider threats as well. Some were non-malicious, some were very malicious. And because, insider threats as well are quite frankly really mischaracterized, in my opinion, right? We kind of think of usually it's an individual with a thumb drive or something to that effect, when today's environment is insider threats are more likely to be groups of individuals working in concert together, because that's about access and access enablement, right? And we really need to consider that access enablement piece, as well as the access, are key issues that we need to really defend against as we really look forward. Even when I left the FBI, we knew that in the future, looking horizon, technologies were going to improve to such a degree that they would really counter a lot of the adversary's capabilities. Because, while you can't necessarily stay ahead of an adversary's thoughts, of a criminal's thoughts, of what they're going to evolve to, certainly the technology will be improving over time to be able to do this. But the one thing that we cannot change is that the need for those individuals to access the data to do their job. And we knew at that point that those would be the most susceptible part of the supply chain that can be compromised based on an adversary's need. We still see it today. Ransomware can be insider threat enabled, and we've seen many cases of that as well. And so it's not just about stealing information; it's also monetizing that enablement of access. So adopting these type of zero trust models to really secure organizations, especially as data moves, external to the organization, external to the university, are going to be key in their security profile and reducing risk in the future.
Perfect. Thank you. Moving forward, let's see here. So our ninth question today. So obviously colleges and universities, they're struggling with talent and technology gaps, just like everywhere else. And, what are some of the approaches, at the University of California, Monty, is taking to address this?
I think one of the things we'd have to rethink, especially during COVID, is the idea that you have to be 30 minutes away from an office is sort of now not really important. So we've had to think about, when we're looking for talent, where do folks live? Does that really matter anymore? And so working from home and being flexible with those arrangements. It all depends on sort of the role and the expectations, but I think for the most part, we're able to be really flexible with, sort of the new normal. And I think, not only, hiring folks, but keeping folks is also a challenge. And so, when we look at some of our locations who are in, Santa Cruz or Berkeley or San Francisco, Los Angeles, we're competing with large corporations with big pockets, and so it is a challenge to retain folks that are there. So we've got to make them feel part of the mission. We've got to give them something that that they can feel part of the community. We've got to develop those staff. We've got to train them. We've got to invest in them. And give them the skill sets and make them feel that they, are contributing to something bigger than themselves. And that's what we need to do to try to retain and also hire good talent.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Uh,
go ahead.
yeah, I mean, when we think about this, we kind of think about it in threes for this one. I think about professional talent. I think about the up and coming growing student talent, and thirdly about the community. You know, Certainly cybersecurity is a team sport. It is all about the community, and quite frankly, in the education space, there's a phenomenal opportunity to help students are grown in that space to make sure that they're, providing overall security for the entire ecosystem. And so there's a place where universities are quite frankly very uniquely positioned to be doing both, right? You can have to get that top talent, even though there's a lot of competition for sure. We even have competition against Mandiant for our top tier people as well. But there's also the unique opportunities that universities have, and the University of California, participates in, and how they grow that talent to really work in that ecosystem, because it does become a community. So who's going to come out of there? How are they trained? And how are they going to also protect, others, or create the next capability that will do wonders for us to protect universities and other organizations? And, when we're talking about, for instance, if, get down to like the crisis core emission moment, which usually is a breach, right? That's probably the most scary of all the moments. How are we ensuring that we're getting the top talent in that? And kind of getting away from a resume based model, we would suggest is that you really want to get into some place more of a threat space model where there's a practiced event to where you're measuring their true capability to do these kind of breaches in a safe environment, and be able to test their capabilities and validate that they have the right skill sets, but also use that as a teaching mechanism. Um, you know, Help students get into SOCs, help students learn how to defend, help students learn how to react and respond to breaches within the risk plans, the IR plans, and the playbooks and use cases. There's a unique opportunity, and University of California plays a significant role in that for the all of our communities.
Perfect. Thank you. So we still have two more questions that I'm going to be asking you. That said, we're starting to get close to the top of the hour, so we're going to be eating into our Q&A where our audience members can submit their questions. That said, since we're all here to hear what Monty, Chris, and John have to say, we'll continue. I'll ask those questions live for them. But if you have any questions, so you, the audience, that you want them to answer, please make sure to put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure that they're sent over to Mandiant so that they can be answered after the call. All right, so let's see here. So question 10. So based on like everything else we've been talking about, are there any other, additional core concepts that, colleges and universities, their leaders and officials, should be thinking about? And what are some recommended measures that should be in place? And also, just to add to that, what are some of the characteristics you'd expect to see in a more comprehensive, holistic cyber program? A lot to unpack there.
So I guess I can take a stab at this, and then I'm sure the others will have things to add as well. I think one of the key things is recognizing that information security is really about that combination of people, process, and technology to protect your institution. And you really need all three pieces of that to work together. And one of the other things that Monty and I have both worked on over the years is kind of shifting the idea away from thinking of the information security team as the defenders of the perimeter to looking at how do we establish more of a concept of cyber resilience. And so one of the models that we like to use is the NIST cybersecurity framework, which really breaks it down into 5 separate functions. And when you think about your program, you really should take a look at if you're addressing all of these. So being able to identify what the assets are that you're trying to protect, the protection of those assets, which tends to be where more of the traditional cybersecurity tools tend to live. Can you detect if an attacker gets in? Can you respond once an attack takes place? And can you recover from that attack once it happens? And so as you're thinking about your program, to have a holistic cybersecurity program, you really need to be able to address all 5 of those things across the people, process, and technology realms. So I don't know, John or Monty, if you have anything you want to add to that.
I would just add in terms of the leadership aspect, it really is tone at the top when it comes to, how robust your cyber program might be. So, if leadership is underscoring and giving the direction that this is a top priority, you're going to be more successful because they're already, buying into what you're trying to achieve. And then it's easier to work through some of the challenges that come with cyber maturity because you know that you've got the support of your leadership.
Yeah, I'll again bring it down to a few things here. A holistic cyber program needs to have governance, needs to consider risk, needs to consider visibility and practice. And I know that's kind of two, but that's really important to bring those two together. You have to have that governance side to ensure there's consistent processes and policies across there that meet the regulations and culture of the organization. Culture cannot be, quite frankly, not taken into account when you're dealing with cybersecurity, because these are about also the people and the processes. That visibility, you can't protect what you can't see. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to defend themselves while blindfolded, but it is a difficult challenge to really to do that. So, visibility is key. And the other part about really being able to practice that, we want to ensure that everybody has, in those type of events, you have good playbooks and use cases, but you have to have that instant response plan. You have to have that practiced, and it has to be exercised on a very consistent basis, at least quarterly, across the entire spectrum, right? You want to have that both horizontally and vertically um, really challenged and looked at and exercised and improved upon because it isn't involving a document for when that crisis occurs. But I would say, though, for all of those three elements, they have to be intelligence and risk informed. You know, they the cybersecurity team, to a degree, do have that defending mission. Knowing who's combating you can provide key information how to best combat that threat and how to best mitigate that risk. And to Monty's point, I would agree. You certainly want to have that. You want to have the executive buy-in, right? So, really becoming more aware of how to position up conversations, position up where tomorrow may need to be, and position up what you will need for outgoing years is a very important conversation to become skilled in. And if you can take those assets together and bring all of that, frame that into one conversation, you'll be very successful going forward in trying to grow your program over time. As opposed to what we were talking earlier, the challenges of today's dollars, we don't know what's going to be tomorrow. We certainly want new dollars, not reusing old dollars, but we need those new dollars to help protect us tomorrow.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to move right to the last question since we're almost at the top of the hour and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So this last question, what advice can any of you provide just on building a convincing and effective business case to help obtain buy-in for security initiatives? And I guess, John, you were kind of talking about this a little bit about executive buy-in, but if you want to expand on that a little bit, if you'd like.
Yeah, positioning up conversations and enveloping, what you're trying to achieve are really key. And what I mean by that is that being able to have an executive level discussion that really marries to the vision and mission of all the organization that culturally aligns to the objectives of what you're trying to achieve. And it's important to talk within those terms and align that to the risk that's already been defined. So if you can define what's critical that you're trying to protect, try to show, demonstrate how that will reduce that risk, but aligns to the vision, mission, and culture of an organization. Um, I've seen that become much more successful than trying to position, I need a product because it does X, or I need a professional service because it'll do Y. We have to show that how that aligns to the overall arching mission of the university and what they're trying to achieve, as well as the vision of those who are leading the university and what they want to protect, because it is more than protecting assets too. You are protecting the brand of the organization, and that becomes very important because you're also protecting the donors' dollars, the donors' investments, U.S. or other government or whoever's making the um, providing money to the organizations to do key research or other capabilities. So, it's important that you're protecting all that and showing that you have the good of the organization in mind and what they can expect as a return on investment to the best that you can. but being able to demonstrate that on a consistent basis and having a voice to those leaderships on a consistent basis will continually reaffirm that they've made the right decisions, or if they need to pivot from that decision because there's been something newly discovered.
Perfect. And in our last few minutes, Chris or Monty, is there anything you'd like to add on to what John just mentioned?
I think it's really important to tie your security initiatives back to the teaching and research mission of the institution. Because if you just say, well, there's this risk out there and we need to do something about it, but it lives in a vacuum, that's really hard to get support and traction as you work across the leadership of the institution. But if you can tie it back and show this is how it will help us with our research goals or our teaching goals, and this is here to help, not to impede achievement of those missions, it's really gives you a different stand as you look at how these things can be embedded into the day-to-day processes across the institution.
Perfect. And Monty, anything to add to that?
I would just say, you know, you're talking to leaders and they need to understand in the business terms. And I think that's what John and Chris are saying is know your business. And when you're speaking to leadership, speak in terms that make sense to them. They understand dollars, they understand reputational risk, they understand that they don't want to be in the newspaper. So, you know, focusing on techie terms and you know, jargon is a loser. You need to speak in their terms.
Yeah, great advice. Perfect. So like I said, we're almost here at the top of the hour. So we'll just end it here. That said, if you had any questions that you sent in that you wanted asked during the Q&A, I'll make sure that they're sent over to our friends here at Mandiant so that they can those questions can be answered individually following this call. And actually, as I go through my closing slides in just a few moments, please feel free to continue submitting any of the questions that you may have as they come to mind. And I'll make sure that they're sent over to be answered later on. But first off, thank you again, Monty, Chris, and John for your time here today speaking on this important topic. And of course, thank you to Mandiant. And to you, our audience as well, I would like to thank you for joining us here today. For those of you who enjoyed what you saw here, there are many more upcoming web seminars that are provided by us here at University Business. University Business is the leader in editorial coverage of news, current issues, and trends in higher education. We have a wide range of readers who subscribe for free to UB, and they stay up to date with us online, our web seminars like this one, as well as our newsletters. Also, if you would like to watch this web seminar again, or maybe for some of you who believe that what you saw here would be helpful to your colleagues, as I'm sure that's the case, you'll be pleased to know that all of you'll be able to, you'll receive an email from us at UB at some point soon. And in that email, it will include an on-demand recording of this web seminar, as well as a link to the slides. So look out for that in the coming days, if not tomorrow. So with that, on behalf of UB, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone. Take care, be well, and stay safe. Thank you very much, everyone.